when you're in the act with your partner of creating your next DNA. That is the power of DNA. It is nature's embedded software that is hardwired in every part of your organization, of your body, of my body, of any body. So just imagine there would be such a thing as a digital DNA. Just imagine that you could ask yourself the question, what digital DNA makes my startup tick? And maybe you could ask yourself the question that out there might be new technologies that would stop my heartbeat from ticking altogether. Or just imagine that you would really understand the DNA of startups that would allow you to reconfigure, recombine, re-engage with your environment and make you very wealthy. Good afternoon, Istanbul. Hello. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to take you through a journey of lessons learned. Although I represent the corporate world, I do have a strong feeling as well as passion for what you guys do. In fact, I have 2 children. My wife and I have 2 children, and they're both in your world. My daughter, which you see on the right-hand side, the blonde one, she's in a startup called Desk Bookers, which is Airbnb for office space. Doing really great. And the guy on the left is my son. He's in Google X in Mountain View. So it runs in the family, you might say. For the past 14 years, I was a lecturer and still am a lecturer on digital disruption. So I've seen loads of MBA students that all wanted to be famous, that all wanted to start their own startup. And part of what I want to share with you today is, let's say, the insight of hindsight. If you're somewhat older, you look back and say, okay, so what did we learn? And obviously, that is something that we as a firm do. Deloitte invests a lot into understanding what startups do. We invest in our Fast 50 across the world to identify the real talent. We invest in research, and that is part of what my job is. I'm the EMEA research leader for Deloitte. So let me just share with you 2 research pieces that we are happy to share with you. The first one is on scale-ups. What makes a scale-up different from a startup? What's the difference? And the second one is research that for 6 years we've been doing with MIT Sloan, which is all about digital maturity. So let me just start with the first one. And let me start with the summary, because the summary is extremely important to take in. We researched in 2015 400,000 startups from 24 countries. Huge body of data. Based on that, we found that only 1 out of each 200 becomes a real scale-up. In our definition, a scale-up is a startup that gets to the 10 million price point in revenue. Moreover, we found that most of the scale-ups that are successful, just about all of them, have some sort of an experienced entrepreneur, 40 plus, amongst them, to counterbalance the pizza part of the team. They needed both. What is also very strong evidence in our research is teams perform better. In startup world, the combination of those 2 counterbalancing talents is part of a success. Finally, a lot of startups that turn to be scale-ups are actually very good at timing. Their main talent is to wait, to create the platform, and to launch the rockets into the world when the platform is ready and the market is ready to adopt them. And only 25%, we found, were actually designed from their conception as startups to become scale-ups. So it's worth your while to dive a bit in what makes a scale-up a scale-up. Just a few data. Here you see the revenue over time, first year, second year, third year. A lot of the scale-ups we identified didn't have revenue in the first 2 years because they were assembling their solution in a very neat way. Second part of the data that might be of interest to you is the following. When you look at the median versus the average, this is what you see. Oh, I'm going too fast here. This is what you see. Let me go back for a moment. As you can see, the median is a relatively steady development over time. But as time increases, the average amounts to the difference. So there is a tremendous spread between startup organizations across the world, the 400,000 that we serviced. And the next slide will illustrate in a dramatic way why that is the case. Here you see how when you put over time the evolution of revenue distribution of all of the startups for 7 years in a row. Sorry about the colors, but otherwise you couldn't see it. And you see that those startups that are less than 250K are the orange ones. First year they're big, second year they become smaller. Meanwhile, the failed part of the population increases dramatically. But the most interesting part of this slide, obviously, is the rise of the green one, which is 500,000, 2 million. And the most interesting one is obviously the million-plus part of the sample. And as you can see, that stays a relatively short, limited group of organizations. I will share the slides with you, sir, so you'll get them. Oh, good. So here's a bit of another insight that you might find interesting from a data point of view. Again, this is 400,000 startups. When you look at after 5 years, who met the mark of what we would call a scale-up, so that's 10 million plus, you will see on the left-hand side that the top of it is orange. And the reason is because it's almost impossible to measure. What you're looking at here is 57% is the part that is less than $250,000, I think, euros. Then the second one, which is in between a quarter and 10 million, is 43. But the most interesting one, obviously, after 5 years, is plus 10 million. Now, guess what? When you look at the total revenue that is delivered as a result of this new economic activity, as this new firm, this new organization, this new market combination, then this is what you see. That 0.25% delivers 13% of the revenue of that new economic activity. So there is a very small percentage in this room that will probably make that. And so one of the questions that the research tries to answer is, which markets should you try? Because not all markets are equal, as I'm sure you will agree with me. And this slide illustrates that some industries are more interesting than others. Now, I'm going to share with you this research. So you can read up on it. Major messages are the red ones. Most successful scale-ups have in their management team a seasoned manager with an inside information and view on the market that you're trying to disrupt. Secondly, teams perform better. Find your counterbalancing partner that makes up for talents you don't have. That's okay. Third, make sure you have a platform from which you can launch your rockets and that will allow you to shoot when the timing is right. Do that before you launch the rockets. And then finally, obviously, try and understand what the world will look like once you are a 10 million plus company. Just imagine that you do make it. So for that, I would like to introduce a piece of research that was presented 3 weeks ago in a conference in my home city, Amsterdam, by Deloitte on a big conference called Digital DNA Summit. It is research that we have been doing. Werner Vogels of Amazon was one of my guests. I was the conference chair, and we tried to get a grip with, if you are a bigger company, what actually should you consider? Because you can't run a 10 million revenue company as if it were a startup. You need to learn. And here's some of the learnings. And these learnings come from MIT Sloan. Already for 6 years, we work closely together with MIT Sloan, trying to establish digital maturity. Now, that is obviously something that is very difficult to establish. And the way we do this, or they do this, is to ask a very simple question. In the market that you service, you're now a 10 million startup, used to be a startup, and you're now in the market. In that market, imagine the ideal digitally enabled company that might not yet exist, by the way. And then rate yourself towards that ideal on a scale of 1 to 10. And this is what you get. Early, developing, and maturing. Now, it's an interesting dimension to look into, because when we started this research using the data from MIT, and I need to be clear about that a bit. When I joined Deloitte, I came in from Gartner. I was a researcher in Gartner. And obviously this research was new to me, so I wanted to know more. So for the, in this case, Dutch market, we interviewed 11 big customers of Deloitte, trying to understand what are they doing? How are they interfacing with startups? Do they have a startup fund? What type of process do they have in place to engage? That was the first one. 11 in-depth qualitative interviews. Big companies. The second one was looked at our own portfolio of consulting jobs we do in the market. What type of questions do startups of 10 plus million ask us? What type of scaling problems do they run into? And based on that, we turned to the global MIT database, and we try to identify some lessons learned. We try to identify what is the DNA of digitally enabled organizations. Now, to do this well enough, we obviously had to cluster the in total 52 questions in the MIT research, and we clustered them into 13 different DNA strings. You can imagine there's questions on leadership, there's questions on talent, there's questions on business model, and so on. So at the end of the day, what we found is that there is 13 DNA strings that basically explain whether you will succeed after the 10 million mark has been passed. So we ordered them using the 2,500 companies in the MIT research, and we identified in total 4 different archetypes. This is, I'm going to share with you as well. I want to take you through it very quickly. Across the world, this is what you find. 23% is laggards. I'll dive into each of them in a moment. 26 chasers, 21 fast-moving experimenters, and 30 are talent and strategy leaders. And by the way, the color on the left indicates the level of success. Here's the archetype laggards. And I'm sure when you look at the old world of corporates, you recognize this. They don't do anything wrong. Completely oblivion on what to do. Then there is a group which you could call chasers. They are every consulting firm's dream. They do everything wrong as well, but they spend a lot of money. They throw money against the wall, hoping that it will lead to something. Then there's a third category, which we have called fast-moving experimenters. So these are corporate, like 10 million plus organizations that do fast experimentation. It's not just lean startup. It's DevOps, Spotify model, real time in big numbers. And what makes their DNA special is this configuration. So just keep in mind, each of these slides has the same DNA, 13 elements, but in a different order. Because the order makes the difference. If you organize your DNA differently, you might be more successful. So these guys and girls are good in experimentation. They're very good in leadership, which means that as part of their experimentation, the leadership has a talent to pick the winners and scale them and kill those that don't. Growth hacking type of approaches. And then there's a fourth one, which you will see in the traditional world, but you also see it in startups that have become very successful because you want to protect what you have. And we've called them talent and strategy leaders. They invest heavily in the talent of people they have. On top of that, acquiring new talent. And they are very concerned with keeping to the long-term strategy. Everything starts from a strategic plan. So these four different archetypes, when you sum it up, this is your biggest risk. Once you have established yourself as a 10 million former startup, now scale-up, there's always this risk to say, okay, let's just monetize on what we have. It took us such a long time and so much effort to get here. Let's stop for a while experimenting. Let's do less of that. On the other hand, when you keep all the, let's say, old startup culture in place in a company of 500 plus people, it's not going to work. You need to manage it. So this, to a lot of organizations that reach that next level, is definitely one of their major challenges. Maybe this is also worthwhile to realize. From the four archetypes, we're not going to debate the two on the bottom. You're not there. When you have made it to the 10 million, you are successful, no doubt about it. But still there is, under the pressure of, for instance, the stock exchange or other forces, there might be this tendency to go for the talent strategy leader archetype. Think about that. Think about that in advance, before you bring the company to the stock exchange. Because from our data, it is clear, MIT's data, that fast-moving experimenters by far have the most successful approach in this field. Here's another one. Once you are big, you see a lot in startups. So once you reach the 10 million, you might bump into me. And I might want to be interested in talking to you from our side. And one of the things you will find there is that, I talk to some of you, successful you, say, you need a digital strategy. What do you mean? I'm a startup. I invented it. No. You need a digital strategy because you also have a human relations part of your IT house. You also have a supply chain part. You're running a firm. It's not just a startup anymore. It needs to have a digital strategy. On top of that, what the MIT research tells us, that digital strategy needs to be integrated into the business strategy of that 10 million plus firm. It needs to be completely connected. And what you see happening a lot in startups that become successful is that, quote unquote, the techies do their own thing, the managers do their own thing, and somewhere in between are the customers. So you really need to sort out how you're going to grow to that next level. An exercise that I do a lot with customers is this one. Supposing that you would identify with one of the two. I'm either the experimenter or the strategy and talent led 10-plus startup, former startup. So chances are that your DNA has these characteristics, supposing that you would be a fast experimenter. As in nature, when you decide, I want to have another dog with a longer tail, you find that other dog and you organize for that longer tail. Same is true in companies. You could look at the other successful strategy and ask yourself, from all of the digital DNA traits that they are very good at, which one should I integrate, re-engineer, copy into my DNA? You can't do all of it, because then you will become a chaser. One of the characteristics of chasers, it's category number 2, everything is bad, but they're spending a lot of money because they don't choose. And here, you might ask yourself, maybe a little bit more on talent-driven, or maybe a little bit more on people development. Reversely, you can say the same for the strategy and talent-led scenario, archetype that we have identified. There, when you mirror it, the same discussion is interesting. You're not going to copy the fast experimenter, but 1 or 2 DNA traits might well be really interesting to invest in, or even to acquire in terms of a takeover of a startup company. So when you talk to companies that you would like your company to engage with, big corporates, or even take over, look at them like this. What is their DNA? And what type of DNA are they missing that my company could bring into that big retailer, big airliner, big construction company? So, for a lot of organizations, this is the challenge. Big organizations, when they apply digital, most of the time it's in the core, bottom left. If you're in luck, it will be in what we call adjacent. But it's most of the time investing in known worlds, known customers, known propositions. And I'm sure that if you find the right configuration for your startup and you're a business-to-business startup, you can make a lot of money by helping corporate organizations on the other side, identify the unknown opportunity and deliver digital technologies that fits their current DNA to move into that new world. Because one thing's for sure, those that take the experimental route consider themselves to be very successful. And if there's one thing that in the business-to-business world, the big corporates have serious problems doing, is this. That's what they can learn from you guys. So, I started out with digital DNA, because DNA is a powerful metaphor to understand how an organization works. Like in your body, you cannot change your DNA, but you can find partners and interaction that will change over time your DNA. And definitely, we were not the first one to come up with this idea. Let me just finish off with an illustration of how nature itself deals with disruption and how nature conquers new worlds.
So what we ended up building was basically a petri dish, except that it's 2 feet by 4 feet. And the way we set it up is that there are 9 bands, and at the base of each of these bands, we put a normal petri dish thick agar with different amounts of antibiotic. On the outside, there's no antibiotic. Just in from that, there's barely more than the E. coli can survive. Inside of that, there's 10 times as much, 100 times, and then finally the middle band has 1,000 times as much antibiotic. And then across the top of it, pour some thin agar that bacteria can move around in. The background is black because there's ink in it, and the bacteria appear as white. First, you see they spread in the area where there's no antibiotic, up until the point they can no longer survive. Then a mutant appears on the right. It's resistant to the antibiotic, it spreads, until it starts to compete with other mutants around it. When these mutants hit the next boundary, they too have to pause and develop new mutations to make it into 10 times as much antibiotic. And then you see the different mutants repeat this at 100. And after about 11 days, they finally make it into 1,000 times as much antibiotic as the wild type can survive. And so we can see by this process of accumulating successive mutations that bacteria, which are normally sensitive to an antibiotic, can evolve resistance to extremely high concentrations in a short period of time.
So, summing up, take the time to define your current and future digital DNA. Even if you're just a startup now, but you have ambition to become a scale-up. Read up on the research we'll share with you on the characteristics of scale-ups that are successful. But most of all, if you are in the business-to-business world as a startup, try and understand the digital DNA of your customers. It will dramatically increase your success. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Deloitte.
Thank you so much.
Amazing work. So, in my previous life, I worked in Deloitte, and I was an auditor. So life was very straightforward, 1 and 0. But seeing the transformation on the digital and seeing the transformation of companies like Deloitte and engaging them with the startup ecosystem and with so much research done in the methodologies and digital transformation of other companies, for me is really impressive. So companies like Deloitte, who created the program called Deloitte Up, is going to carry this startup knowledge and information and appetite for innovation to the mainstream. So it's a good time to be a startup, especially if you're in the B2B world, engaging with technology and solving a real problem for the business.
So that was really enjoyable. I really enjoyed it. It was quite theatrical and very powerful. I think it's the type of thing where it sticks with your mind with the storytelling. So that was really impressive.